Hello and welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I'm Caitlin Mercer, Associate Director of the Fellowship Program, and joining us today is Isabella Higgins, currently Europe correspondent for Australian Broadcast Corporation's news section based in London. Isabella previously covered Indigenous affairs for ABC News across online, radio, and television, and she's the daughter of a proud Torres Strait Islander family. Isabella joined the ABC in 2014 as a digital news reporter in Brisbane, and her work, including an important series on Indigenous suicides, won her a short-form journalism award at the 2019 Walkley Young Australian Journalist of the Year Awards. Her internal seminar with our fellows in Trinity term this year was so highly rated that we knew we had to get her back for a global journalism seminar to discuss the do's and don'ts of Indigenous affairs coverage. Isabella, thank you. Welcome, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me. That's quite a lot of pressure to now have to deliver. I hope I can live up to that.
No pressure. I think you can. So let's start nice and basic and tell us, for those who aren't familiar with the beat, what does an Indigenous affairs correspondent cover?
Well, for me, the role was an enormous privilege and honour. And before I get into the nuts and bolts of what I did every day, I'll explain why it was such an honour to do that. So my family are from the Torres Strait Islands, as you mentioned. It's a small group of islands on the very tip of Australia. So it's very warm, very tropical. If you think of palm trees and turquoise oceans and white sand, I'm painting a beautiful picture, but there's also lots of crocodiles, sharks, stingrays, some of which are my family totem. So it can be a little bit dangerous too. But Torres Strait Islander people, they have been living there for centuries and centuries. They have a very rich culture. They're seafaring people. They're known for their dance, for their song, for their connection to the ocean. And if anyone is at all familiar with Australia or is perhaps a bit of a legal nerd, it is where native title in Australia developed, which is the legal recognition of Indigenous Australians' occupation and ownership of the land. So a really important legal case that started there. I grew up in one of the big cities, like so many Torres Strait Islander families. My family just made the hard choice to move away for economic and social reasons. So myself, I kind of grew up somewhere between, mainstream Australian culture, very connected to our Torres Strait side, but one of those people who sort of finds themselves somewhere in the middle all the time. Got a bit of British and German ancestry as well. I would say I fell into journalism, but I always had this burning passion to really tell the stories of First Nations people. And I ended up becoming the Indigenous Affairs correspondent for ABC News, which was a really big job and one that I felt daunted by all the time, and always felt like I had a really heavy weight on my shoulders because Australia is such a big and vast country and there are hundreds of distinct different First Nations communities. I think that's a common misconception people have about Aboriginal people, is it's one homogenous group. But when you think about how big Australia is, for centuries and centuries, all these different distinct groups of people lived alongside each other with their own culture, their own customs, sometimes that are incredibly different. So I always saw my job really as a cross-cultural communicator, as a cross-cultural reporter. I have some knowledge and understanding of my own First Nations community, but I didn't of every other one. And I mean, hundreds of Indigenous languages are spoken in this country. So I felt like I had to go in some ways, much like anyone else would, just with open eyes, open ears, an open mind. I'd always try and learn a little bit of the language wherever I went. And it was a job where I covered TV, radio, online, and the stories were really, everything from sort of daily political coverage of issues affecting Indigenous people to longer form sort of features around suicide, health inequities, justice issues, Black Lives Matter, and the conversation that was going on around that became a really big focal point. So justice issues were something that I was covering constantly. But my goal in that job always was to represent the diversity of this community. And I wanted to represent both the strength and the sorrow in these places, the fact that there are really devastating inequities and, frankly, lapses of human rights that exist in a rich and wealthy country like Australia. It's really important that we cover those, that we're critical of government failures, that we look at why those things understand, that we put a historical lens on them and explain why the issue exists. But I also always wanted to cover the strength, the enduring survival, the huge effort to make sure that language, culture, customs, dance, like these really rich and beautiful parts of all these different cultures, that was put on show, and that you could see the incredible strength in these communities as well. There were so many incredibly strong women, and as someone who was raised by a long line of really strong women, that was always my focus too, was to elevate the voices of women and to show their strength and not just paint them as victims of a society and culture that didn't value them. So it was a job I loved. Really took me all over the country, to many places that many Australians wouldn't go, and that certainly aren't on the tourist trail.
Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out that this beat is not unique to Australia, is it?
No, well, First Nations people, Indigenous peoples live all over the world. I think some ones that we're probably most aware of are in North America, Canada, the United States, so many in South America, but also exist all throughout Asia as well. But I think when we talk about the issues that we cover in Indigenous affairs, some of those, health, education, economic justice inequities, they exist in a lot of communities all over the world. There's a lot of intersecting conversations. And also when we think about the enduring legacy of colonization, the enduring legacy of displacement, it's quite similar to stories that you hear coming out of Africa, the Caribbean, issues around reparations, apologies for historical wrongs. So there's a lot of intersections in the reporting, in the conversations that happen. But yes, Indigenous peoples live all over the world, and sometimes it's striking how similar the experience is in all of those different places.
Yeah. I was editing a paper last term about the Sami people in Norway and Finland, and it's remarkable how similar the issues are.
Yeah.
What's Australia's track record been like when it comes to covering Indigenous affairs? What's Australia's track record been like?
I think it's uncontroversial to say that Australia has a very bad track record of covering these issues. There's 1,001 examples of how mainstream media have represented Indigenous communities poorly. I think at its worst, journalists have treated Indigenous people like zoo animals. I don't want to say at its worst best, but there's often a phrase that gets used in Indigenous affairs reporting by well-meaning but poor reporting, where we describe people looking at Indigenous people through a lens of the soft bigotry of low expectations. So that's a phrase that gets used quite a bit about Indigenous reporting, that we expect so little. We talk down on people. We don't treat them as humans. They're less than. We other them in the process. And I think that is one of the most common issues that we're probably trying to combat today. I think in the past it's been vitriolic. It's been, just there's no way you can argue that it's not racist. But today, the way we're combating racism in stories, it's softer, it's a little bit more polite, but it very much still exists.
Say that sentence for me again. The soft
Bigotry of low expectations.
Oh, that's powerful. That's
and I should say I've stolen that from an Indigenous leader named Noel Pearson. I think he was the first person to say that. And it's something that we really are trying to combat in the Australian space. I mean, I've done a lot of work looking through archives, just even for my own organisations, and there's examples of, people standing over the graves of Indigenous people, talking about their criminal record, talking about how they were unlovable. And these were things that were happening in the late 90s. It wasn't that long ago. But I mean, there are incidents that have happened in this century as well, where we've just used language, we've talked about people in such an othering fashion, we just haven't respected their voice, or we've kind of used Indigenous people as a nice curtain to someone's sort of journalistic passion project.
Yeah. So
Mm.
how do you go about building trust and gaining access when these communities have probably very low trust after being treated that poorly?
And I would say they've got good reason
Yeah.
for their lack of trust.
Mm.
And I always say, I think most people in these communities, like they've got a good radar, like they can look at you pretty much straight up and know what you want from them. And I always say, like, this isn't rocket science about how to be a good reporter in this space. Just show people respect. It
Mm.
actually is that easy.
Mm.
Go in and don't think you're the expert. Don't put words in people's mouths, and ask people how they want to tell their story, like where is comfortable for them, where would you like to sit down, in what format. I often find the way we work in broadcast journalism, where you do a sit down interview and you put someone on one side and someone on the other, is a really awful way to talk to people, especially in some Indigenous communities where it's seen as disrespectful to look some people in the eye, or to look someone in the eye who you don't know very well. So sometimes I would sit next to someone while they were painting and I would just talk to them. I'd sit next to them in the car, we'd rig it up with GoPros, and we'd have a conversation the way you probably do in a more normal day-to-day fashion. Like it's not that often that you sit down and just stare someone, look them in the eyes, and can't look away for 15 or 20 minutes. And I know some people are very comfortable with it, but I think we've all had those moments where we feel uncomfortable with someone's piercing gaze,
Yeah.
let alone someone who perhaps, English is a second or third language, someone who's talking about something incredibly traumatic. So I think there's ways that we can give people ownership over their stories. And I think as journalists, we're used to holding people to account, and there are government figures, business leaders, people who are paid to be accountable to the media, people who are trained to speak to the media. But we have to remember, when we go into Indigenous communities, they're not those people. They don't owe us anything. Like, it's for them to choose whether they want to tell us their story. So I always made a rule that I would go in and I'm not someone who would ever promise, like, if you talk to me, this is going to lead to change. If you talk to me, people are going to see this. I think I would always say, I think it's really important. I think lots of people need to hear this story so that they can understand it. But I want them to be comfortable with the choice that they're making and not promise them anything. They've chosen to be there, and then give them some ownership in how they want to communicate and talk to me, how much they want to say. And I think they're just basic principles of respect. I would often think, if this was my mum, if this was my sister, how would I want someone else to treat them in this situation, especially on delicate issues? So I don't think it has to be really hard. People don't expect you to know everything about their culture when you've come in and you're an outsider. They just want you to show respect when they let you know what they are.
Yeah. It sounds like such a rich area, so full of kind of diverse, untold stories waiting to be told. So if someone like me really wanted to go and do the Indigenous Affairs beat, should a non-Indigenous journalist cover Indigenous affairs?
I know that lots of people have different views about this. My personal view is that in the mainstream media in Australia, in most of the world, there just aren't enough First Nations people. There aren't enough First Nations journalists, and we can't sit and wait for the industry to catch up to make sure that it's only Indigenous people telling Indigenous people's stories. I think it's really important that everyone wants to do it, that everyone does it respectfully. I think when we silo Indigenous stories as like only the Indigenous reporter should do any Indigenous story, that becomes problematic. And
Yeah.
it means we've kind of ostracized or carved off this niche where we don't do that about a lot of other communities or groups, or say, like, only people who have health issues can report on health issues. I think it's really important. I think we need to build the literacy of non-Indigenous reporters. But as I said, it doesn't It's not rocket science. I think if people are respectful, if they go in with the open mind, the open ears, don't act like an expert, people can do it in a way that's respectful. They can do it in a way that is really helpful for the conversation.
Mm.
And it's building trust between the communities and the mainstream media. It's
Mm.
building those lines of communication that haven't been there before. So I think it's really important that many, many people are telling them. And I think sometimes when we say, oh, only Indigenous reporters should cover these issues, we almost make it feel like activism, and it's absolutely not. Reporting on human rights violations, reporting on people who've been let down by governments,
Yeah.
by successive governments, by society. That's not activism, that's journalism at its best.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that everyone wants to tell those stories and sees how important they are and aren't intimidated by them, but just goes in with that respect.
Mm. You said the word siloed there, which
Mm.
leads me to the next question. Does having an Indigenous affairs beat risk siloing the community from the wider news agenda?
I think there's always a risk, but I think it is also really important to have specialists.
Mm.
Sometimes there are really complicated issues, and people who have a better understanding of the cultural landscape can go in and bring a specialist knowledge. And specialist, I do find, slightly problematic because, I was born into this community. Does that make me a specialist? Well, not necessarily, but I think people who have a really good understanding of these issues, who have really good contacts, you
Mm.
can't get across some of these issues in an hour. That's why it's important to have specialists, have people in rounds, to have people who know the contacts, because I think sometimes we're at risk if we don't have that we rely on the same old voices to tell the story all the time. We always, if it's a story about one community, there's one community leader who always speaks, and we're not representing all the voices in that community. And often we're giving the microphone to the people who speak the loudest, not the people who have the best thing to say. And I hate the perception sometimes that it's difficult to do these stories or people don't want to talk to you. I think most of the time we're just not passing the microphone around. We're giving it to the same people.
Mm.
And that's why I think it's important that we do have specialists, but as much as possible, everyone is engaging with these issues. And I should say that is my personal view. I know others who think like that, but I know other people who would like to see, Indigenous-led media for Indigenous people as well.
Is there any sort of generalized Indigenous affairs training for reporters at ABC?
There is a little bit, and I think what the issue that we come up with in Australia in particular, and this is probably something that also exists around the world, is that Indigenous history wasn't particularly well taught in Australian schools. The conversations changed remarkably in the last few decades. We look back at history through a different lens. There's a lot of work being done in academia to challenge narratives that were perpetuated about Indigenous people for decades and decades. So the issue is you have incredibly experienced, incredibly intelligent people who just have this huge gap of knowledge. And it's difficult to put someone in a crash course and say, okay, like in 2 hours, you're going to come out, you're going to be an Indigenous expert. So definitely we have cultural awareness training.
Okay.
Things like that. But it is, I would say the broader issue is society's lack of understanding of these issues.
Yeah.
There is incredible material out there, I think, on most Indigenous communities to catch yourself up. There's incredible nonfiction work, fiction work, movie. There's so much out there if you do want to learn about this. And I think sometimes we can't just rely on organizations to provide that for us. As journalists, we should be hungry. We should want to know this.
Yeah. So the onus, the responsibility, you can take personal responsibility for your own education.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That makes sense. I wanted to talk to you about climate journalism. In what sense do you see Indigenous affairs and the unfolding climate crisis? What's the intersectionality there?
The intersection is that Indigenous communities will probably be some of the worst affected and the first affected. And I think the other intersection is that there are incredible solutions in Indigenous communities. It's becoming a broader, more mainstream conversation around Indigenous fire management after the horrific 2019 bushfire season. People really wanted to start and learn and engage with traditional knowledge of land management, how to use fire to combat fire, and that's really taking off in some parts of Australia. Also, there's a growing conversation around like what foods, what crops we grow. There's a push towards having more native products. It's still a really small market in many ways, and I think that's where there's solutions, and that's really where we can turn to Indigenous communities to not just feed the media, but to feed society, to feed government responses, and it's happening on a small scale. But also when we think about where some Indigenous communities are in Australia, they're in the middle of the desert, they're on low-lying islands, not all of them, but some of them. These are the places where it's going to get incredibly hot, where seawater is going to rise. Where my family are from, there's already instances of water rising, washing away cemeteries, washing away cultural artifacts. There's a real fear that these places won't be inhabitable. And there is action being taken, in the Torres Strait, there's legal action being taken, but they will be the first and hardest hit. And that's the saddest thing for the people who've probably contributed the least. And it's such an ongoing issue that housing in these places is not adequate. A lot of the time, Indigenous people were moved, relocated around different homelands, and then the housing that they were put into is just completely deficient. It's not got airflow, light. It's just not going to withstand any sort of climate challenges. So they're really at the face of it. And I think there's some incredible solutions that we probably should be turning to there as well.
Yeah. And when you talk about solutions and solutions journalism, constructive journalism, there has been some research that points to minority communities and Indigenous communities really appreciating this style of journalism and engaging with finally not being the object of bad news stories. Have you had any experience of that in the field?
We always tried to do solutions journalism where possible, and it wasn't necessarily that you fully had to swap hats and be like, today is a solutions journalism day. Sometimes it would just be when you were doing a story that laid out a really complicated problem, within it you included what the Indigenous community's possible solution was, what people were pitching, what they wanted to see happen. That was a way to put that solution in there, to highlight Indigenous voices, to not make it feel like it's a story of doom and gloom, but to show people are thinking about it, they're thinking about it critically. They just need resources a lot of the time. But also sometimes we would just try and really capture that strength in the community as well, and show how people were solving problems in their community, to show that they're not sitting around and waiting for the government to do it. They're not sitting and waiting around for other leaders to do it. They're moving and they're acting. But if you give them a bit of help, imagine the scale at which this change can happen. And there's really incredible work happening even in, the mainstream education sector in Australia. You've got more Indigenous teachers, more Indigenous principals who are leading schools, and the work they do in some of these places is extraordinary. Just by getting these people into schools and being leaders in schools, you see real change. There's still an absolute shortage of Indigenous principals in Australian schools, but I met several and it was extraordinary what they were doing. It was always one of the stories where if I was feeling really down or weighed down by the round, or feeling like I couldn't please anyone, or it was all too hard, I'd be like, I need to go to a school. I need to see the spirit of these gorgeous Indigenous kids, and I need to see the incredible teachers who are trying to change their lives. And you would just leave so uplifted. I'd be on a high for a few days. I'd be re-energized by their zest for life.
It's a really good tip for managing your well-being as a journalist.
Yeah. You need to do the nice stories alongside the heavy ones.
Yeah, give yourself a break.
Yeah.
I I wonder. I mean, you've actually already mentioned quite a few lessons there, but I'm wondering if it's worth saying directly what are the lessons that can be learnt from a career in Indigenous affairs coverage that apply to other minority communities?
I think I know I've said this about 10 times, but I think it is about going in and not thinking you're the expert. And I think sometimes as journalists, we're really bad for doing that. We do think we're the expert. We go in, we think we know what the story is going to be. And it's being humble enough to listen and accept that your hypothesis might be wrong and
Yeah.
to challenge yourself and not try and find someone who matches your view or matches your hypothesis, but speak widely to people in communities. Don't rely on speaking to one person. There are often people in all of these minority communities who have cultural leadership, and it's really important to speak to them to respect that cultural leadership. But I would always find the views of men in power and women who are dealing with a different side of the problem or a different side of the community would often have a really different experience and a really different view. And they wouldn't always want to talk on camera, but it was important to hear that and to know that you're not homogenizing a community based on what one person says. And I know I'm guilty of doing it throughout my career. I know we all are. Yeah. And I think that is the biggest challenge we have working in minority spaces, is not homogenizing and having a diversity of perspectives within a community and not making out like it's dissent, but making out that it's healthy debate and representing it and showing the nuance, the grey area, and that it's not so black and white, a lot of these issues.
Yeah. For those who are on the call, I'd love to invite you to put your questions for Isabella in the Q&A box. And we will go to our fellows downstairs in a second. But let me just start with a question from Ted Sullivan, who says, do we eventually need to reconcile our modern way of life with that of Indigenous people? And is that possible?
It's a very big question.
It's
is
a
it
big
possible?
one. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of ways that the modern society we live in and traditional Indigenous values can be reconciled. In Australia, there's very big conversations going on around things like constitutional recognition. And I think people often wonder, what is the tangible value of this? Well, the tangible value is you recognise Indigenous cultural leadership and you allow people to behave in that fashion, to have power, autonomy, agency over their own lives and their own community. And that's what things like constitutional change, enshrining Indigenous leadership into Australia's constitution.
Yeah.
It is a very academic and legal way that we allow Indigenous culture to thrive and survive within Australia. And through that, you hope that they can live alongside each other, and perhaps as time goes on, they don't feel so distinctly different, but they're comfortable neighbours, I would say. I think when we look at things like the way we live, what we eat, they are ways that we can really shift, help our country, help our climate by trying to live or grow things that are supposed to be there. And I think that is such an important lesson in this century as we face the climate crisis. Do we need to be eating wheat in Australia? Could we be harvesting things like kangaroo grass that can be turned into flour? There's some really big questions like that. And I think we haven't really confronted them or in a really meaningful way in Australia, but I hope we start to.
Yeah. Yeah, let's go to Tanmoy downstairs from Sanity Media in India. Tanmoy, ask your question.
Hi, Isabella. Thank you for your time and wisdom. I was struck by something that you said early on about the risk of treating Indigenous communities as one big homogeneous group. And this is a risk, isn't it, with all underrepresented communities? And I'm wondering if you have some advice on how journalists could stop themselves from falling into this trap. Specifically, what practices could they embrace in their day-to-day work rituals? Thank you.
I always think when I was doing Indigenous stories, and even when I was covering the Queen's death, and we were sort of trying to capture the views of different communities in the UK, it was about not just having, one token diverse person or one token Indigenous person. It was about having 2 or 3 voices and looking at them and thinking, are they a different age? Are they different genders? Do they live different lifestyles? Do they have different levels of education? And I think it helps you pick different people who have a really different experience of the world and helps you to get a much richer view of the issue you're trying to dissect and explore. So I think it's applying a few different principles of diversity to a story that is about underrepresented or minority groups as well, and in that community.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Rookie error. Johnny from the BBC, do you want to go for your question?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. Hi, Isabella. Thank you so much. Echo what Tamway says. It's brilliant to have you here. It's something I'm fascinated by. I was born in Australia, although I grew up in Ireland and now live in England, so it's sort of sitting across everything. What I'm interested in asking you is, or finding out your thoughts on, it's obviously fantastic to have the stories of Indigenous First Peoples being told all across the world, and it's equally fantastic to have somebody from that community in a position of influence, I suppose, to be able to tell those stories or facilitate the stories. But is there a danger of reporters from any particular characteristics or diverse background being pigeonholed or typecast into just doing stories about those areas that echo their background? So LGBT reporters or disabled reporters just being pigeonholed into stories like that. And I guess just to distill it down, is there many Indigenous people in Australia or in ABC that would be considered mainstream reporters or journalists and given the opportunity to do stories outside of where they're from?
Thank you. I think that's an important question, and absolutely. Oh, sorry, I just had a slight internet issue. I think it's a really important question, and I think there's absolutely a risk that Indigenous reporters or anyone from a diverse background is siloed. I think as long as people are passionate and want to be reporting on that round, it's okay. It should be, they have to feel the need to do something else. But it is a real challenge, I think, to get Indigenous journalists from other diverse backgrounds into senior positions. That's something that's an ongoing challenge. So we get people in sort of junior pay bands, and then if they work in Indigenous affairs, it can be a completely thankless space. It can wear you out spiritually. At the end of the day, you don't get to leave your work at home. And I think I was speaking to a Ukrainian friend who was talking about the difficulties of this. You don't get to leave your story at home when it's your community. It's not a job. It's not just professional. You get this real spiritual corruption where you really carry the weight of all of it, and it becomes really, really heavy and difficult. And that's certainly something I felt towards the end of my 4-year stint doing Indigenous affairs. And I was lucky that I had people around me, managers who were supportive of me doing other things, because I don't know if I could have kept doing it at the speed and capacity I was for years and years and years. And I think maybe if I had, I would have just become so burnt out and left. And I think that's a challenge we have, particularly when we bring in people and they're working in what is largely an all-white space, and having to fit in and interface with that cohort of people at work, but then we expect them to be this, you know, to heal the wounds of the past, to go into Indigenous communities and do what, you know, the most experienced reporters can't do.
Yeah.
So it's a really heavy weight, I think, that people from diverse communities carry. I think we've made a lot of gains in the last 10 years at the ABC in terms of having reporters of Indigenous background, people living with a disability from many different diverse culturally and linguistic groups. But we have trouble with retention. And I think it is to do with the heavy weight that they carry and the fact that they don't just get to come and be a journalist. They have to be a cross-cultural communicator, that they might deal with discrimination in the workplace, that then they have to go and confront really difficult issues in these communities. So it's an ongoing challenge. And I think one of the answers is pushing more people from different backgrounds into senior management and senior leadership, because I think they're more cognizant, more understanding of those issues. And I also do think it's important that you've got people of all of those backgrounds who do mainstream reporting, political reporting, sports reporting, because you just get a richer perspective. You've got people with richer contacts. It's not just about doing the right thing by diverse people. It actually makes our content better. We better represent our audience. We better represent issues. We're more diverse in our voices in coverage. I think it's a survival mechanism for public broadcasters, more than it is this nice kind of lefty ideal or the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So sorry, I feel like I went on a bit of a rant there, but
Well said. Well said. Let's stay on this rant for a second, because how do I phrase this? I'm from South Africa. You're from Australia, and I think in some of the other former colonies, like Canada, there's still this perception that you kind of have to go and do a stint in Europe, and then you're the real deal. This might be a bit too personal, but do you feel that weight at all of like having to go and do the Europe stint to kind of prove your mettle, when actually you were doing such important and profound work back home? And this is a leading question, but let me just stop there and let you respond.
I would say that I did feel like other people viewed me without a lot of legitimacy, probably when I did Indigenous affairs. I think I often felt like people recognized the work I was doing was difficult. Maybe sometimes they recognized that it was good, but I don't think they really saw me as like a hard, edgy reporter who could do it all. And ultimately, the reason I wanted to come to Europe was because I wanted to challenge myself and I wanted a break. And maybe I'd started to believe that too. Maybe I'd started to believe I could only be good at doing Indigenous affairs reporting. So I wanted to challenge myself, and maybe I was trying to prove people wrong. I'm not sure, but I will say nothing was ever as hard as being the Indigenous affairs reporter. I mean, just the weight, the burden, the relentlessness, it was so heavy. And a lot of the time, like it is such a thrilling and exciting job to be in Europe. It's been a
holiday.
Well, I mean, not always. And I mean, it was pretty horrific, you know, going to Ukraine and seeing what's happening there and seeing that humans can do that to other humans. But yeah, I do think that is something that Indigenous reporters face. And I think goes to that point I was making earlier, where I think sometimes in journalism we view reporting on diverse communities as a form of activism or something that's not hard or edgy enough, or is a bit soft. And as I said, they're often human rights violations. They're the worst sort of government failures, yet we don't want to view it through that lens. And I just ask people to ask themselves, like, why do you think that, other than that the people have brown skin? Because so often we'd report on issues, and if it was happening in a city to white people, it would be on every major newspaper. It would have been leading bulletins in the news. But because it was happening to Black and brown people in far-flung corners of the country, no one wanted to care.
Yeah.
So I challenge people to ask themselves why they think that about reporting on many of these issues that aren't just Indigenous issues, but on many of those diverse and underrepresented communities.
Yeah. And Isabella is not saying this. I am saying this, not Isabella. But I would say that I feel like you have all this pressure, like to go to Europe and prove yourself. And then you get to Europe and you're like, oh. So these guys have the same problems. It's not all perfect. And
Yeah.
anyway, sorry, that's not from Isabella. That's just my opinion. I want to read you a question from Eula Rocha in Brazil. They say, we see Indigenous people taking the ownership of their narratives. Many of them are no longer interested in having their stories told by us journalists, as they now have cameras, mobile phones, social media platforms, and even an independent channel, Media India, to tell their stories. How do you see this? And in this context, how do you see the role of journalism? And I'll add on to that, the explosion of Indigenous content on TikTok has just been so incredible to watch. Are you seeing the same thing?
Absolutely. And I think it's an important shift, and in many ways it's a correction. I think for so long these groups couldn't represent themselves, and so I think it's natural that they now want to, and that they don't necessarily want to engage with the mainstream media. And I think it is really important for those communities that they can see themselves in a really unfiltered way. I do think the role that Indigenous-led media plays is quite different to that the mainstream media plays. And I think it is more important than ever that every journalist is building contacts with Indigenous communities, with people from diverse communities, and perhaps that we start building media literacy. We explain what we're asking of people.
Yeah.
We think about what we're asking people. I mean, sometimes if you think about what a daily TV news gives someone like an hour and a half so that of notice if they're lucky, and you want them for like 20 seconds of their time, and 20 seconds of TV time, but you're kind of asking them for about 3 hours of their mental space while they think about what they're going to do, while they sort of accommodate you while you're there, while they're doing the interview. Like, is there a better way we can work so that we're not burdening ordinary people all the time? I don't know. But I feel like maybe there is. And so I think we do face a really big challenge in mainstream media organizations to persuade people that we are the best place for their stories, that they can feel authentic, like the story is being explained in their own words and their own voice. And it's a real challenge. I don't think there's easy answers there. And I think all you can do is point people to the work that you've done in the past, be really upfront with them, what they're going to look like in your story, who they're going to be sitting alongside, those sorts of things. But I think it's important that those groups see themselves in those ways, because I think that's a representation that people like me didn't have when they were growing up. They couldn't open up social media and see 100 people who looked like them. You had to wait until they came on the TV every, few months.
Let's go to Jussi from Finland.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, I'm Jussi from Finland. Thank you very much for talking to us today. And speaking of mainstream media organizations, I could imagine that covering Indigenous people is something that journalists everywhere have a lot to learn. But in my experience, journalists and newsrooms seem to be quite reluctant to accept that their coverage has been maybe less than ideal in the past or currently. And I think this maybe stems from fear of being seen racist. And I think, like you said earlier, lots of this coverage today comes probably with good intentions, and I think the notion of soft bigotry, of low expectations was really spot on. So my question to you is, have you witnessed this kind of reluctance, and do you have any thoughts on how to overcome it if you have experienced this?
Yeah, the reluctance, I know it well. It was my greatest challenge to overcome it. And I found that often my greatest challenge was to overcome this notion in newsrooms that people wouldn't be interested in the stories of these communities.
Yeah.
You know, it was like, oh, you know, would people even read that? And like, to me, I'd want to scream and be like, well, it's a story that's got every human emotion. Like, this is an incredible story. Why would you think that? Except that they don't look exactly like you.
Yeah.
And I think the way we change it is you do reporting that is compelling, and that so many people do engage with it, that you kind of start smashing those notions out of the water. And I think we started doing that at the ABC. We had these huge runaway successes, and I don't ever want to think that, you know, like a success means that it got a lot of clicks online, or, you know, a lot of people gave you good feedback about it. But it was sort of like the sad means to the end in some ways, that you had to prove that it was a good story. And for me, I always felt like I was working, you know, 30% harder to figure out how the production, how the narrative would stack up, who the voices were going to be. It usually meant working later and longer, because I felt like I couldn't rely on just doing an ordinary story. I had to make it better so that people would respect the content. And that is part of the onus and burden that I think Indigenous reporters or people who are working in this space often feel. And I just hope that if we start doing enough stories that people love and engage with, and I think when we start doing things like solutions journalism, like when we were doing stories about traditional fire management, everyone wanted to read them because everyone wanted to know how does this work? Is it something I could do? Is it something we could do more broadly? Because everyone wants to know how you might be able to combat these things. So I think it's finding those intersections, thinking about what sort of in the public discourse and how you can bring Indigenous voices to that, like in the fire example. But yeah, it is a real challenge. I accept that sometimes.
We say on the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, every story is a climate story, and I think to a degree there's an element of every story is an Indigenous story, or could be.
Yeah.
While we've got the camera where it is, I think Sun Kiat's question, it kind of relates to this, and perhaps what you've said is part of the answer. But Sun Kiat, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, Isabella. Yeah, my question is somewhat related to Ulysses. So my question is, how should journalists convince their editors, or at least get their buy-in, that the minority groups are worth covering? I'm asking as a reporter from an ethnic Chinese language daily in Singapore that covers mostly issues that are about the ethnic Chinese majority in Singapore. So I'm just wondering what's your thought on this?
Well, my view always is like we can't rely on people thinking it's the right thing to do. We need to persuade people by saying, I'm in a bit of a fight for survival at the moment, for eyeballs, for viewership. And there is a very real argument that by representing different communities, we are hopefully going to bring new audiences. We're going to be more relevant to more communities. And that means the survival of our organizations, because ultimately we need people engaging with us. We need people, not just inner city elites or, different, traditional news audiences. We need to be appealing to new people if we want our organizations to survive. And I think that's a really important argument, and we can talk about how many people these issues affect, the intersectionalities with other communities, and that is almost the most powerful weapon we have. Is we're doing a story that maybe we haven't done all the time, and hopefully with it we bring a new audience who aren't engaging with us already. That was something that I would always try to use. I mean, in the organization I was in, we were really trying to engage people who lived in outer suburban parts of big cities. So I would try and find stories in those places, and maybe a year or two before they wouldn't have been commissioned. But because we were desperately trying to get new audiences in some places, and I think if you're talking about, minority Chinese communities, I mean, that's how many people from those communities are there around the world? I mean, that's a lot of eyeballs that you can potentially bring to an organization.
Yeah, new audience segment and young audience segments are two magic words that seem to open a lot of doors.
Yeah.
Let's go to Brett from the US. Brett's operating the camera and asking a question at the same time. So it's very
Hi, Isabella. Yeah,
Hello.
thank you for bearing with us here, and thank you for being here to discuss these issues. I was curious, now that you cover Europe, if you've seen any overlap in terms of the coverage that other people have done or that you've been doing in Europe around migration and the coverage that you were doing with and of Indigenous communities.
Do you mean sort of because I think in what I observe is that people rely on the same stereotypes, probably the same sort of veiled, polite vitriol as well, where I think there are small words that can other communities really easily. And I think in many ways, media performers have become very good at using them to harness audiences to incite fear or hatred, frankly, in some instances against certain communities. And that I think is quite a universal experience for many diverse communities when they're being reported upon. And sadly, we've got people who use that sort of public rhetoric are often people who are in positions of power. So there's a real challenge for journalists to challenge the language and to challenge the narrative. And also I think another commonality I see is sort of the way we often do, in Australia we call it car crash reporting, where you report on numbers and figures. 300 people have moved here, 25 people died in the channel. It's like that. Really, by fixating on the numbers, we really dehumanize the issues, and I think that is something that
well said.
Well,
yeah, very well said.
I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yes, that was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. We've got two more questions, but I think I'm going to ask them just so we can fit both in. The second last question comes from Zsofia from Hungary. She's working on a project about the representation of Roma people in Hungary. And she asks, is it helpful when Indigenous people establish their own media to talk about their stories from their own perspective? Or do you see a disadvantage to that approach?
I think it's hugely advantageous for the community, and I think it's really important that they exist. In Australia, there's the National Indigenous TV network. They have an online presence as well, but also throughout the country, there's lots of small radio stations. And I think the way they operate, who they are, their audience is different. I think they profile stories of both strength and struggle really well. I think they're more willing to talk about the wins of their community. The language they use is different. I think it's incredibly important for those communities to have that representation. And I also think there are just more spaces for Indigenous voices there. There's more opportunities for different segments of the community to tell their story and to share it with people who are engaged. I don't think it makes the work of mainstream organizations any less valuable. Our audience is different. I think we need to give ourselves a really high benchmark of what we're doing. But I think the two should coexist and can coexist, and I think in many ways serve different purposes. I think it's great if these sorts of communities can turn to mainstream media, feel represented, learn something about themselves or learn something about their community and feel respected, but I think it's really important that there's other outlets for different types of storytelling as well.
This is a big question, and I don't expect you to have an answer off the cuff. It's probably a journalism research question, but if the role of that independent Indigenous owned media is sense of identity, what is the role of mainstream media?
Well, I think mainstream media has a duty, I think, to educate. And I think we have a duty to bring with us a lot of historical context and to explain issues better.
Right.
I think naturally, if you are in those Indigenous spaces, a lot of that is understood.
Yeah.
You can get into details, you can tell parts of the story that you're not going to get in the mainstream media. But the mainstream media has a duty to explain how we got here. You know, we don't have a absolutely chronic overrepresentation of Indigenous people in Australian prisons just by accident. That didn't happen because of policies that have been in place for 5 or 10 years. It's got to do with the history of the country, the way the country was colonized, and it's the duty of those mainstream media to fill in the gaps in our education in many ways, I think, and to give people the context and understanding of these issues, and people who don't live and breathe it every day. So I think they can play really different roles, and both are of equal importance.
Right. Inform the electorate and contribute to the public agenda, mainstream, and Indigenous, in-depth, home, identity forming.
And I think in mainstream media, I would become frustrated by this because I think we assume that our audience isn't Indigenous. And when I was doing throws, I would try and write it in a way that if people didn't understand, hopefully they get the context. But if you do really understand, there's more in the story for you as well. There's more in there that you might learn, that if you're following it, you understand these incremental updates. And it's a challenge to try and write for both of those audiences, but I think we can do it. I think it's totally possible. But I do think they play distinct and important roles as two segments of the media.
Brilliant. Great answer. Yunsi from Singapore gets the last question. How do you write about the very real issues that diverse or minority communities face without coming across as blaming them? For instance, some communities may be overrepresented in drug or prison figures, but highlighting this could cause people to think about the communities negatively.
Well, that's a challenge, and I think it goes to context and explanation, and I think it goes to the way we frame stories as well, the sorts of headlines we put on them, the tone in which we write it. I think we can write stories in a way where we're not blaming or painting a broad brush stereotype, but where you are explaining and unpacking how these things have come to be. You can have people in the space explaining what the issues are, the sort of the things that need to be addressed to challenge or to stop that overrepresentation. So I think it's all in the language, and I think it's often also all in who we ask to talk about these things as well. And I think humanizing those stories is really important, because it's important for everyone else to see this is humans, it's human lives, it's not numbers, it's not some scary mythical community who live on the other side of the city to you. They're just people who, because of their circumstances in life, their life didn't end up like yours. And it's important for other people to understand that. So I think there's a lot of things you can do to get into gritty issues without blaming or stereotyping. But it is a fine line sometimes, I think. And I just think we need to be always really hyper aware of the language we're using. And there's been plenty of instances where I can think where I've lost battles with headline writers, and I'm not totally happy with them. And they're fights all the time. And I didn't win them all.
Isabella, thank you so much for teaching us so much in 1 hour. I feel like we've had a masterclass, and a very inspiring masterclass. I'm taking away the soft bigotry of low expectations. I think I might get that tattooed somewhere. It's brilliant.
It's beautiful. But
it is
it's not
very
my
wonderful.
words, I should say.
Still.
I'm just passing the knowledge on.
Isn't that what we all do? And thank you. We're not here next week. We're back the week after on the 2nd of November with Hamid Mir, the last man to interview Osama bin Laden, currently covering the floods in Pakistan for some very interesting insights on climate journalism in Pakistan. Isabella, thank you. And stay in touch. You're part of the family now.
Well, thank you to everyone for listening to my voice for an hour.